Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series Rendezvous with Death, where we follow Americans who join the World War I effort before America actually enters World War I by fighting for the French Foreign Legion. In the last episode, we saw significant American death in the Battle of Artois in 1915. Some of the legionnaires are convalescing, others are moving on to different areas, but other Americans are going to form the Escadrille Américaine, or the American Squadron. This is when a group of Americans take to the sky as an early corps of fighter pilots. On May 13, 1915, Kiffin Rockwell awoke in a peaceful world he hadn't known for many months. Since leaving Paris in August 1914, he hadn't slept in a proper bed with clean sheets. For months, he hadn't been out of earshot of machine gun and artillery fire. The quiet of Brittany presented a stark contrast. Now, in the officer's ward of the military hospital in Rennes, he was afforded every convenience, he called it, and a pretty blonde Alsatian presented a welcome distraction. But true to his nature, he grew restless as the weeks passed and his leg healed. His thoughts were never far from his comrades in Artois. Rockwell's idealism proved unshakable even as he heard news from the front confirming that the Legionnaires' gallant attack had been all for nothing. In a letter to a French acquaintance, the Vicomte de Pellew, he tried to explain his feelings about the sacrifices being made by the foreign volunteers and their French officers. He wrote, "I don't want you to think I'm cold-blooded, without feeling, but the horror of it all is overshadowed by the feeling of pride and admiration I have for them all. This life does not hold such great value in my eyes as it does in some people's, and I feel that those men that died that day died having made a success of their lives in their own little way, doing something for posterity, and their characters are their souls which will live and be passed down from generation to generation. So is that not success? And what more can a man ask for in life than success?" It wasn't the result, the failure of the offensive in this instance, but the gesture, the act itself that mattered the most to him. Kiffin Rockwell was where he wanted to be. Well, perhaps he didn't want to be in the hospital, but France in 1915 he thought was made for great deeds. As his leg became less stiff and the weather grew warmer, Kiffin Rockwell wanted to get out because Paris beckoned. The previous summer, in scenes of hopeful pageantry, the City of Light had seen its best sons off to fight. But as the death toll grew, and many returned, injured or disfigured, the city became subdued. The cultural and artistic life of Paris quieted. Black was a color that best captured the prevailing mood. Black, the color of austerity, which permitted the people to feel a sense of solidarity with the army. But this mood didn't last. Tentatively at first, but then more confidently, the old Paris reasserted itself. This was natural. There was now a realization that the war would be a prolonged affair. The death tolls in 1915 were no less staggering than in 1914, but one could gradually become numb to them. Paris had been under the threat of bombardment by German aircraft and within range of the Germans' heaviest guns in 1914, but it wouldn't be again in danger of falling to the Germans until near the end of the war in 1918. Thus the city and the home front in general would become increasingly disconnected from the soldiers in the trenches. Paris changed its mourning dress and began slowly to get back to the business of living, creating, and making money. To be fair, this Paris wasn't the Paris of the time before the war, but it was not the Paris of the early part of the war either. Since being invalidated out of the Legion, Kiffin's brother Paul had established himself in the capital city. He had tried to be reinstated, but it was to no avail. A soldier who couldn't carry his own pack or fire his rifle simply wasn't wanted. So instead, he made himself as useful as he could to his brother and their fellow countrymen fighting in the Legion. He put them in contact with members of the American expatriate community, as well as sympathetic Parisians, which meant a small loan here, a drink there, a hot bath when on leave, communications with home. These friends would also reach out to loved ones with news of the casualties. Eventually, Paul landed a job as a war correspondent for the Chicago Daily News and with the information section of the French Army. He made connections, got to know Paris, and became a familiar figure in the American expatriate community. He became engaged to a lovely French girl who was the daughter of aristocratic parents. One can imagine how excited he was to welcome his brother into the life he had made for himself in Paris, when in late June, Kiffin Rockwell left the hospital and was generously granted 1 month's convalescence. The two brothers were reunited in the greatest city in Europe. At this time, Kenneth Weeks' final fate was still uncertain, and his mother, Alice Weeks, was in Paris looking for news of her son. As Kiffin Rockwell had known and served with Weeks, it was unsurprising that his mother sought some solace from him. The two men were of about the same age and shared an unalloyed idealism about the struggle they were involved in. Kiffin was always keenly sensitive to the widows accompanied by small children and grieving mothers in black that he encountered. In fighting the Germans, he may well have created more widows and grieving mothers himself. But they were in Germany, and his concern was France. Skipper Pavelka, recovering from his bayonet wound in the foot, joined Kiffin for a brief sojourn in Paris. Rockwell certainly had a sense of himself as a gentleman, and tended to draw a line between himself and the others as a result. To his credit, however, he embraced Pavelka, the professional rustabout, like a brother. Rockwell justified the exception he made in Pavelka's case in a letter to Paul, writing that while Pavelka's family didn't amount to anything, he has the sentiments of a gentleman. His recognition of Pavelka's worth showed that Kiffin's elitism, for he definitely was one, wasn't based so much on who one's parents were or where one had attended college, but rather on one's character and actions. Kiffin Rockwell could be very judgmental, and his friendship was not easily attained. But once it was pure gold. The Rockwell brothers were always willing to send Pavelka a few francs and to look out for his interests with their Paris connections, considerations that Pavelka, a common sailor from nowhere in particular, could never have relied on otherwise. Besides Alice Weeks and Paul Pavelka, Kiffin Rockwell also encountered another old comrade from the Second Étranger, with whom he had served along the Chemin des Dames, William Thaw of Pittsburgh. Bill Thaw was finally where he wanted to be from the beginning of the war, in aviation. He was in Paris on temporary leave from the Escadrille C, Squadron C for Caudron, the make of the airplanes they flew, and he made quite an impression on Rockwell in his dark blue French aviator's uniform with the red and silver pilot's wings attached to the collar of his tunic. The experiences Thaw shared with Rockwell over a bottle opened up an entirely new realm of possibilities for the Carolinian. Kiffin had already learned from Skipper Pavelka that the First Étranger, as he knew it, was being reorganized and likely consolidated with other Legion units. Therefore, a return to his old unit was unrealistic. Then what? Transferring into the aviation, as it was called at the time, seemed to present a fresh and exciting start. As his leave drew near, Rockwell made up his mind. He would take to the air. Bill Thaw was one of the few Americans who joined the French aviation service because he genuinely loved to fly. His exploits before the war, dropping out of Yale to pursue his passion for flight, the East River Bridges stunt in 1913, and his transatlantic quest to convince the French government to purchase the device he and his brother had designed, all spoke to this. Thaw was an aviator, yet his initial request to be permitted to fly for France was politely declined, and he had to join the Legion instead. Thaw understood what was at stake in 1914, and he wasn't about to let his disappointment over not being able to fly get in the way of doing the right thing, as he saw it. As a member of the Second Étranger, he shared his fellow volunteers' experiences from Toulouse through Champagne and Picardy to the Chemin des Dames, but he knew he wasn't cut out to be a soldier. The marching alone was murder on his feet. But he was graded a marksman and took part in many Legion actions. Thaw belonged. He was one of the old guard. Then one day in November 1914, Thaw, cold and miserable, looked up from his post in the trenches and saw two airplanes dueling in the skies above. There was something mesmerizing about these two fragile machines darting at one another in graceful maneuvers. Thaw and his comrades on the ground watched speechless. But Thaw knew what it felt like to be up there. And in that instant, he made up his mind to wrangle a transfer to the aviation. At the first opportunity, he set off in the snow with two of his countrymen, Bert Hall and James Bach, in tow for the nearest French aerodrome. Felix Brocard, an officer there, was aware of Thaw's reputation as a pilot and promised to see what he could do. The irony of it was that Hall and Bach were transferred shortly thereafter, but inexplicably, Thaw wasn't. Brocard soon gained command of his own squadron, and Thaw again asked for a transfer. This time it was arranged to Brocard's Escadrille D, Squadron D, or Dépêche du Cygne, again named after the particular make of airplane the squadron flew. It was the first unit for which Thaw would fly, though not as a pilot, but as an observer and machine gunner in the two-seat monoplanes.